So I'm sure you guys have noticed these headlines circulating that in the wake of ditching zero COVID, China is predicted to have 1 million COVID deaths. And if that's true, that would be just terrible news, a million people dying. In total, since the beginning of the pandemic, worldwide, there's only been 6.6 million deaths. So I went ahead, did a bunch of research, and I want to give you guys my take on whether or not this 1 million figure is anywhere close to being accurate. Here's another article from The Guardian claiming a similar thing, that experts estimate 9,000 deaths per day. We also have this article looking at it from a slightly different perspective. This is the impact on the Chinese manufacturing industry. China's factory activity shrank for the third straight month in December at the sharpest pace in nearly 3 years as COVID infections sweep through the production lines across the country. It says the drop was the biggest since the early days of the pandemic back in 2020, and they're citing Beijing's abrupt reversal of zero COVID. Now, a question I had is, what is the latest COVID policy in China? So they ditched zero COVID, but what replaced it? So lockdowns have been scrapped, quarantine rules have been abolished, a negative COVID test is no longer required to enter public transport, restaurants, gyms, and other public buildings. And in just a couple days, they're going to remove travel restrictions and open up the borders. And here's a clip I found in Shanghai showing the situation on the ground outside of a hospital. Yeah, so this does confirm that COVID is indeed running rampant throughout the country. This hospital is completely overwhelmed with patients. And here's another post from DW News showing very similar images. And again, they're citing that same figure of 9,000 people dying per day. And in response to images like this, some countries are beginning to reenact travel restrictions from China.
Some breaking news. We're just hearing that the United States of America has announced new COVID-19 testing requirements for travellers from China. That being because of the surge in infections that we've been hearing about coming out of the country.
Now, unfortunately, when it comes to seeing how many people are getting infected and dying from COVID, we cannot rely on the official numbers. Because according to the CCP, there are 0 new infections, and since the beginning of the pandemic, only 5,200 people have died. But from the articles and videos I just showed you guys, obviously the problem is much more widespread than that. So to help guesstimate how many cases and deaths there are, we have to look at the comparable data. So for example, the US has a population of 330 million, and in total there's been 100 million infections and just over 1 million deaths. So that gives us an infection rate of about a third of the population and a death rate of 1%. Now, you should know that each country has different levels of infections and deaths based off of their COVID policy, but I'm going to use the US as the comparable because the population is big, diverse, and now with the end of zero COVID, their policy and behavior is much more similar. Although one important factor and difference is in terms of vaccination rates. We know that vaccinations do change the death rate, and in China they have an overall vaccination rate of 90% versus 70% in the US. But that number is actually a little bit misleading because this virus doesn't affect all age groups equally. In fact, it's very biased towards killing old people. If you're over 50, your odds of dying from COVID, they're not high, but they're much bigger than for the younger age groups. And when it comes to the vaccination rate amongst this older generation, it is much higher than the general average. And for China, it's actually the exact opposite. So this article said that even though 90% of China has been vaccinated, only about 2/3 of the over 80 have been fully vaccinated. So age is one factor skewing this data, but the other is the vaccine itself, because China has their own homemade vaccine that's not nearly as effective as the US vaccine. So this data is the vaccine effectiveness against fatal disease by age group. When it comes to one dose, we can see that across the board, the biotech vaccine is much more effective than the Chinese vaccine. The difference does shrink when you get to 2 and eventually 3 doses, but you can unequivocally say that overall the Chinese vaccines are just less effective. So in light of this data, I think using infection rates and death rates from the US is more than fair to estimate how many people might die from COVID in China. So if we go ahead and do that, the Chinese population is of course a lot bigger, 1.4 billion, with an infection rate of a third of the population. We're talking about 420 million infections, and with a 1% death rate, that's actually 4.2 million deaths. So that's my research on the topic. Let me know in the comments what you guys think, and I'll see you guys in the next one.